When you picture ancient Egypt, your mind may drift toward glittering pyramids, the slow drift of the Nile, and the solemn, linen-wrapped figures placed in stone coffins thousands of years ago. What you might not imagine is the scene in a quiet apothecary shop in 17th or 18th century Europe, where a small brown jar sat on a wooden shelf, labeled in tidy script, Mumia. Inside, there was no herb, no spice, no mineral powder. Instead, the jar contained ground-up fragments of ancient Egyptian mummies, flesh and bone reduced to dust. And for centuries, doctors, healers, and ordinary patients believed this powder could cure almost anything. The idea seems unsettling, even grotesque, to us now. But to understand how it came about, you need to set aside modern ideas of science and medicine, and step into a world where remedies were a patchwork of tradition, superstition, and a strange persistence of ancient authority. The word mumia originally comes from the Arabic word mumia, which referred to bitumen, the tar-like substance sometimes used in embalming. In the Middle Ages, Europeans misunderstood the word. When travelers from the East described Egyptian mummies, their embalmed remains often darkened by resin and pitch. Western scholars concluded that these bodies were filled with natural medicinal substances. The bodies themselves, they thought, had been preserved in bitumen, and since bitumen had long been used in medicine for its supposed healing properties, surely the mummies themselves must contain healing power too. By the late Middle Ages, a thriving trade developed. Merchants brought actual fragments of mummified remains into Europe. Apothecaries crushed the dried tissue into powder, selling it in small doses. Wealthy patients could afford genuine Egyptian remains, while poorer ones often received counterfeit versions, the bodies of executed criminals, dried in the sun and ground into a convincing substitute. It was gruesome, yes, but for Europeans. At the time, there was nothing shocking in the practice. To them, it was no more unsettling than consuming a bitter herbal tonic or swallowing a concoction made of animal parts. Mummy powder was advertised as a cure for nearly everything: headaches, stomach complaints, wounds, even the plague. Doctors recommended it for bruises, believing that consuming powdered human flesh would help heal from within, in the same way it had once been part of a body. This was not a random idea, it was linked to the medical philosophy of sympathetic magic, the belief that like heals like. If flesh was damaged, perhaps ingesting flesh would restore it. If blood was lost, perhaps taking in dried human material would replenish strength. For centuries, this thinking guided much of medicine. Doctors prescribed bloodletting for fevers, purging for illness, and even drinking blood for vitality. Against this backdrop, eating powdered mummy did not seem outlandish. By the 16th century, demand for mummy powder was enormous. Apothecaries across Europe stocked it. Even famous figures such as Francis I of France and Francis Bacon are said to have taken it. The mummy trade became so profitable that it drove grave robbing in Egypt, with local diggers opening tombs to supply merchants. Sometimes, entire corpses were shipped to Europe, where they were displayed, dissected, or divided up. Wealthy collectors bought them as curiosities, while doctors saw them as valuable sources of medicine. The fascination with mummies was not only medical but also cultural. They symbolized a link to ancient wisdom, an exotic product from a mysterious land. This trade blurred the line between artifact and commodity. Mummies were not only seen in museums or cabinets of curiosity, they were consumed, spoonful by spoonful, as if they were spices from the East. Accounts from the time described the powder as having a bitter, tar-like taste. Some physicians mixed it with wine or honey to make it easier to swallow. Others combined it with herbs to disguise its origin. But many patients knew what they were taking. Some may have shuddered at the thought, others may have felt reassured, believing they were absorbing the strength of ancient kings. One can imagine the scene: a sickly nobleman reclining in his chamber, a servant bringing a goblet of wine laced with brown powder. The physician, solemn in his long robe, assures him this is the wisdom of the ancients. The nobleman sips, grimacing, but hopeful. After all, what better medicine than the preserved body of a man who had endured for thousands of years? By the 18th century, skepticism began to creep in. Enlightenment thinkers questioned whether there was any real benefit to consuming mummies. Some physicians admitted that the supposed cures were based more on tradition than on evidence. Still, the practice persisted into the 19th century, lingering in some corners of Europe. Meanwhile, artists found another use for mummy powder. The pigment known as mummy brown became fashionable in painting. Made by grinding up mummy remains with oil, it produced a soft, earthy tone ideal for shading and shadows. Pre-Raphaelite painters in the 19th century even used it, until one day, in a London studio, an artist realized with horror that the paint on his palette had once been part of a human body. The revulsion that followed marked the beginning of the end for the mummy trade. By the late Victorian era, the idea of eating or painting with human remains was no longer tolerated. Mummies moved from apothecaries into museums, their roles shifting from medicine to artifact. Behind this story of fascination and horror are the dull, practical details of supply chains. Merchants organized shipments from Cairo and Alexandria. Custom houses logged boxes labeled as resin or medicine. Apothecaries priced mummy powder by the ounce, keeping careful ledgers. Some batches spoiled in transit, arriving damp or moldy. Others were found to be fakes, just dried animal flesh, passed off as genuine. These little details, the weighing, the haggling, the quiet scraping of dried tissue into a mortar, were the unnoticed rhythms of a trade that linked tombs in Egypt to sick rooms in London, Paris, and Amsterdam. Today, the idea of eating mummies seems repulsive, a dark stain on the history of medicine. Yet at the time, it was accepted, even ordinary. Doctors prescribed it without hesitation, patients swallowed it without protest. The practice reminds us how fluid the boundary between medicine and superstition can be, and how what seems rational in one era can become grotesque in another. But it also raises questions that linger. How did people reconcile the sacredness of the dead with the urge to consume them? How did the great reverence for ancient Egypt coexist with the casual destruction of its most intimate relics? And perhaps most strangely of all, what did it feel like, to swallow a powder made of a human being, and believe, truly believe, that it might bring you health? When you left off, you had entered the quiet chamber of a European apothecary, picturing the jars labeled mumia and the solemn physicians prescribing it with confidence. But this was more than a medical practice, it was part of a larger cultural web that connected Europe's hunger for the exotic, its reverence for antiquity, and its anxieties about mortality. To understand why powdered mummies held such a grip on the European imagination, you need to look beyond the apothecary's shelves and into the wider world of Renaissance and early modern thought. For Europeans of the 15th and 16th centuries, ancient Egypt was not simply a foreign land. It was the source of hidden wisdom, a civilization wrapped in mystery. Greek writers like Herodotus and Pliny had long written about the marvels of Egypt. By the time of the Renaissance, scholars believed that the Egyptians possessed secrets of medicine and alchemy that had been lost over time. So when merchants arrived in Venice or Marseille with darkened bundles said to be mummies from the sands of Egypt, they were not just selling a substance. They were offering a tangible connection to that lost wisdom. A pinch of mummy powder seemed to carry with it the authority of the ancients, a direct inheritance from a civilization that had mastered death itself. In a world where so many medicines were uncertain, the aura of antiquity gave mumia a credibility that herbs or minerals alone could not. Doctors of the Renaissance and Baroque eras were not ignorant men blindly prescribing superstition. Many were learned scholars, deeply engaged in study. Yet their medicine was rooted in humoral theory, an ancient framework that emphasized balance between the body's fluids, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness, they believed, arose from imbalance. Mummy powder, with its dry and earthy qualities, was thought to counteract excess moisture in the body. Physicians prescribed it for hemorrhages, bruises, and fluxes, expecting it to restore equilibrium. Others recommended it as a stimulant, believing it contained the essence of life preserved for centuries. Some even suggested that mummies retained the spirit of the sun, absorbed during their long rest beneath desert skies, and that consuming them could impart vitality. In this sense, mumia was not just a physical substance. It was thought to contain a vital force, a kind of essence of eternity. Of course, there was never enough genuine Egyptian mummy to meet demand. By the late 16th century, the trade was riddled with fakes. European merchants hired locals in Egypt to plunder recent graves, drying corpses in ovens and selling them as ancient. Others ground up the remains of criminals executed in Europe and marketed them as exotic imports. Contemporary sources complained bitterly of the fraud. Ambrose Père, the famous French surgeon, argued in the late 1500s that most of the mummies sold in Paris was fraudulent. He openly ridiculed the idea that powdered flesh could cure disease, calling it false and foolish medicine. Yet despite these critiques, demand persisted. Patients wanted to believe. Doctors who doubted often prescribed it anyway, knowing their patients would trust it more than other remedies. In this sense, mummy powder was as much about belief as about pharmacology. Beyond medicine, mummies seeped into European culture as symbols of mortality and fascination with death. Cabinets of curiosity displayed entire bodies or fragments, drawing the curious to gaze upon the preserved remains of antiquity. Writers and poets mentioned mummies as tokens of time's passage. Painters used mummy brown as a pigment not only for its aesthetic qualities but also for its symbolic weight. One can imagine an artist applying a brush dipped in mummy brown to the canvas, thinking of the centuries compressed into that single stroke of paint. It was, in a way, painting with history itself. The use of human remains in this way reminds us of the blurred boundaries between reverence and consumption. Europeans admired Egypt as a land of wisdom, but they also consumed it, literally, through trade, medicine, and art. As the Enlightenment unfolded, more voices began to question the practice. Physicians who embraced reason and empirical observation challenged the old superstitions. The Royal Society in London, founded in 1660, encouraged experimental science, and gradually the authority of humoral theory weakened. Still, mummy powder lingered. Old traditions die hard, especially when they are profitable. Apothecaries stocked it because patients demanded it. Patients demanded it because generations of physicians had recommended it. And physicians recommended it because, in the absence of reliable cures, almost anything was worth trying. Yet beneath the surface, disgust was growing. Accounts survive of people who recoiled when they realized what they had swallowed. By the 18th century, the idea of eating human remains began to appear barbaric rather than exotic. By the late 18th century, the mummy trade began to shift. Mummies were still imported, but now they were more likely to be displayed than consumed. European travelers brought them back as souvenirs of their journeys. Collectors displayed them in drawing rooms. Museums acquired them as symbols of their scholarly prestige. The medical market collapsed slowly, but persistently. By the Victorian era, the main association of mummies was no longer medicinal but cultural, strange relics to be unwrapped at fashionable parties, or exhibited behind glass in the British Museum. The transition was not sudden. In provincial apothecaries, jars of mumia probably sat on shelves long after physicians stopped prescribing it. Like any outdated medicine, it lingered in dusty corners, a reminder of earlier beliefs that if you look closely at the history of powdered mummy, what stands out is not the grotesque detail of human remains but the quiet persistence of belief. People believed in the power of the past. They believed in the wisdom of antiquity. They believed in the healing properties of substances they could not test or prove. And perhaps more importantly, they believed in their physicians. When a doctor in a long robe wrote a prescription for mumia, the act carried authority. To refuse it would be to question not only the treatment but also the entire framework of knowledge that supported it. This is the boring yet revealing part of the story, the way ordinary trust and habit allowed a strange practice to persist for centuries. Today, we may shake our heads at the idea of eating ground-up corpses. But perhaps the more unsettling thought is not the practice itself, but the reminder that medicine is always provisional. What seems certain in one age can become absurd in the next. What we swallow today with confidence may one day appear as grotesque as mummy powder. So the question lingers: when people look back at our own medicine centuries from now, what will they find shocking? By the 19th century, Europe had fully entered the Victorian age, a world of top hats, formal manners, and an ever-deepening fascination with the exotic. It was also the era that finally saw the end of powdered mummy as a common medicine. Yet the decline was not abrupt, nor was it entirely due to scientific discovery. Instead, it reflected a subtle interplay of medical advancement, cultural curiosity, and evolving sensibilities about death and the human body. In the early 1800s, some apothecaries still stocked mumia, though it had become increasingly rare. Physicians who continued to prescribe it were often those trained in older traditions, or those catering to the nostalgic tastes of wealthy patients who wanted to partake of the wisdom of the ancients. But by mid-century, chemistry and experimental medicine had made serious inroads. Doctors now relied on observations, controlled experiments, and emerging pharmacology rather than centuries-old superstition. The humoral theory that had justified mummy consumption was fading, and with it, the authority of powdered corpses as medicine. Medical journals began publishing articles denouncing the practice. One prominent physician described it bluntly: consuming human remains offered no more benefit than swallowing dust. Another criticized the trade as unethical, arguing that even if mummy powder could heal, it involved the desecration of the dead. Still, some diehards clung to it. Reports survive of elderly patients in provincial towns demanding a small jar of mumia, insisting that it had cured ailments in their family for generations. In these moments, the persistence of belief seemed stronger than reason. If medicine abandoned mummies, culture embraced them. Victorian society developed a peculiar obsession. The public unwrapping of mummies. Traveling exhibitions brought Egyptian mummies to cities like London and Paris. Spectators crowded into lecture halls to witness the careful removal of linen wrappings, the revealing of blackened skin, and the exposure of preserved features. These events were framed as scientific inquiry, but they were also entertainment. Audiences were fascinated by the tactile presence of the ancient dead. Professors and showmen alike explained the process, sometimes offering morsels of history, sometimes indulging in sensationalism. The mummy was no longer a medicine, it was a spectacle, a bridge between life, death, and curiosity. Artists and writers, meanwhile, drew inspiration from these displays. Mummies appeared in Gothic novels and romantic poetry, often symbolizing time's relentless passage, mortality, or hidden knowledge. The dark, earthy pigment once used in painting remained in use, but the symbolic weight shifted. The pigment evoked history, antiquity, and mystery rather than healing. One of the most significant transformations was the relocation of mummies from apothecaries and private collections into museums. Institutions such as the British Museum and the Louvre acquired mummies for display and study. Curators carefully labeled and described them, highlighting their cultural and historical importance. By moving mummies into the museum context, society reframed them from consumable medicine to cultural artifact. Visitors could gaze upon the preserved remains, study hieroglyphs, and imagine the lives of the people beneath the linen. In doing so, museums preserved not only the bodies themselves but also the memory of a time when Europeans believed they could extract vitality from the ancient dead. This shift also marked a subtle moral awakening. It became increasingly unacceptable to destroy human remains for profit or medical experimentation. The centuries-long cycle of consumption, from Egypt to Europe, finally gave way to preservation, study, and respect. Looking back, the story of mummy powder is not merely a tale of grotesque medicine. It is a story about human belief, about the extraordinary persistence of tradition, and about the ways people reconcile curiosity with morality. For centuries, European society accepted the consumption of human remains because it fit within their understanding of the world. The idea of benefit, rooted in sympathetic magic, was compelling. The authority of physicians and the allure of ancient wisdom reinforced the practice. Even as skepticism grew, the inertia of tradition allowed it to continue. The decline of mummy medicine was gradual, shaped not only by science but also by shifting ethics and changing cultural perceptions of death. Where once jars of mumia sat on apothecary shelves, now mummies rested in quiet museum halls. What had been medicine became history, what had been consumption became contemplation. Today, powdered mummy survives mainly in stories, museum displays, and art history. It serves as a reminder of the strangeness of the past and the adaptability of human belief. There are even modern discussions among historians and anthropologists about the scale of the mummy trade, the ethics of consumption, and the faint traces of this bizarre practice in literature and pigment. Yet there is also a human dimension that is often overlooked. Consider the Egyptians whose remains were consumed or displayed. Consider the apothecaries and patients who trusted their physicians. Consider the scholars and artists who interacted with mummies in different ways. Each group, in its own way, participated in a quiet, almost mundane cycle of belief and commerce that shaped European encounters with antiquity. It is, in a sense, a story about ordinary lives intersecting with extraordinary objects. About curiosity, commerce, and the human desire to harness the past. About how even the most unsettling practices can become normalized when reinforced by authority, habit, and a touch of exoticism. As you imagine the final jar of mumia gathering dust on a Victorian shelf, or the last public unwrapping of a mummy in a crowded lecture hall, consider this: history is full of practices that seem strange, grotesque, or unnecessary to us now. Yet they made sense to the people of their time. And so, perhaps the most unsettling question is not about mummy powder itself, but about the medicines, rituals, and beliefs of our own era. Which of today's accepted practices might be judged as bizarre or even unthinkable centuries from now? How will future generations interpret our understanding of health, science, and morality? In that reflection, the story of powdered mummies becomes more than a tale of human consumption. It becomes a mirror, showing us the quiet, persistent patterns of curiosity, belief, and human behavior that stretch across centuries. Imagine a quiet Victorian bedroom, gaslight flickering over heavy curtains. The furniture is polished to a dull sheen, and in the corner rests a chamber pot, a simple ceramic vessel with a rounded rim. At first glance, it seems unremarkable, just part of the domestic landscape. But for centuries, the contents of that pot, urine, were considered by many physicians to hold remarkable medicinal power. You might shudder at the thought, but in the world of Victorian medicine, urine was not waste. It was a diagnostic tool, a therapy, and sometimes even a cure. Doctors prescribed it to drink, to bathe in, and occasionally to smear on the skin, believing that it could treat everything from rashes to internal ailments. To understand why, you need to step into the quiet rhythms of daily life in the 19th century, when science was emerging but old traditions still held sway. The first thing to understand is that urine, in historical medicine, was considered a mirror of the body's internal state. Physicians practiced uroscopy, examining the color, smell, and consistency of urine to diagnose disease. A pale yellow indicated imbalance of humors, a deep amber suggested fevers or dehydration, and cloudiness might signal infection. In a sense, urine was both a window and a guide. By understanding it, a doctor could decide how to treat the patient. But diagnosis was only one aspect. Some practitioners went further, claiming that urine itself could heal. The logic may seem strange now, but it was grounded in the belief that the body contained natural remedies within itself. If a substance was already part of your body, why might it not also restore balance when reintroduced? From a modern perspective, the idea of drinking urine may seem absurd, but the Victorians were operating under a framework where empirical evidence was limited, and observation often blended with tradition. In households across England, France, and Germany, physicians sometimes prescribed patients to drink their own urine, or the urine of someone deemed healthy, as a tonic. It was believed to strengthen the body, promote digestion, and even boost vitality. Some accounts suggest that young children and the elderly were offered small doses to support weak constitutions. Doctors would often recommend mixing urine with wine or water to mask the taste, or sometimes adding sugar or herbs to make it more palatable. One can picture a patient, hesitantly lifting a small glass to their lips, trusting that this foul-tasting liquid could restore strength and ward off illness. It was not merely a home remedy. Some physicians published guides on the practice, complete with dosages and instructions for proper collection. The urine had to be fresh, ideally taken in the morning, and stored in clean vessels. Instructions included recommendations for avoiding contamination, demonstrating that the practice, while unusual, was treated with a surprising degree of seriousness. Urine's use was not limited to drinking. Physicians and domestic healers also prescribed bathing in it. In some regions, it was believed that soaking wounds in diluted urine could disinfect and promote healing. Others recommended it for skin conditions such as eczema, rashes, or fungal infections. The rationale often drew upon the antiseptic qualities of urea, a compound present in urine. While Victorian doctors would not have understood the chemistry in the way we do today, they observed, sometimes correctly, that it could have mild beneficial effects. These practices also reflected broader ideas about the body and its interaction with the environment. The body was not separate from its surroundings. Fluids, sweat, and excretions were part of a continuous cycle of health and disease. Using urine therapeutically was a way to harness that cycle, to turn something discarded into a potential remedy. The use of urine as medicine also intersected with social norms. It was considered acceptable for self-treatment, especially in private, but there was embarrassment in discussing it openly. Manuals and guides often used euphemisms or formal language, describing the waters or a tonic derived from the body, rather than the substance itself. Nevertheless, urine therapy crossed social boundaries. Both aristocrats and peasants reportedly experimented with it, though motivations differed. For the wealthy, it was sometimes a novelty or a fashionable eccentricity, part of the broader fascination with unusual remedies. For the poor, it was often practical, an accessible, free substance in a world where doctors' fees and imported medicines were costly. The practice also reflected the Victorian desire to rationalize health. People wanted to observe, test, and control illness, even if their methods seem unorthodox today. Urine was tangible, measurable, and readily available, qualities that made it attractive in an era still developing rigorous scientific standards. Historical accounts provide glimpses into ordinary people's interactions with urine therapy. One physician noted a woman who drank small doses daily to strengthen her digestion, reporting that she felt more energetic after a week. Another described a man who soaked a chronic skin lesion in diluted urine, claiming it eventually cleared. Not all outcomes were successful, of course. Some patients experienced nausea, vomiting, or no benefit at all. Yet the belief persisted, bolstered by anecdotal reports and the human tendency to remember successes while forgetting failures. There were even organized movements around the practice. By the late 19th century, some advocates promoted urine therapy in pamphlets and lectures, arguing for its natural efficacy and emphasizing its purity compared to chemical tonics. They framed it as a return to a simpler, more harmonious way of supporting health. Part of the persistence of urine therapy came from the limitations of contemporary science. Victorian medicine was evolving rapidly, with discoveries in microbiology, physiology, and chemistry reshaping understandings of disease. Yet knowledge was unevenly distributed. Physicians in large cities might embrace the latest research, while rural practitioners often relied on traditional remedies. Even when chemical analysis revealed the components of urine, its composition was interpreted through the lens of humoral theory or vitalism. The presence of urea, salts, and trace minerals was framed in terms of balance, rather than as a purely biochemical phenomenon. From today's perspective, the practice seems misguided, but in context, it was part of a sincere effort to understand and manipulate health using the tools and beliefs available at the time. Like many historical remedies, the boring details tell the most about the practice. People kept careful records of how urine was collected, stored, and administered. Morning urine was preferred for its supposed potency. Ceramic or glass vessels were cleaned thoroughly to avoid contamination. Dosages were measured by the teaspoon or ounce. These mundane routines reveal a surprising seriousness. This was not casual quackery, it was systematic, regulated by custom and reinforced by belief. In a world without antibiotics or reliable pharmacology, attention to small details could make the difference between mild benefit, neutral effect, or minor harm. Despite growing skepticism among scientifically minded physicians, urine therapy persisted into the late Victorian period. Its endurance was partly due to human nature. Once a remedy enters habit and culture, it is difficult to dislodge. Patients who believed in it were reluctant to abandon it, doctors who respected patient preferences often allowed it. There is also a psychological element. Urine, derived from the body itself, symbolized self-reliance and purity. To use it was to take control of one's own health, to harness an internal resource rather than rely on foreign chemicals. In this way, urine therapy exemplifies a broader theme in Victorian medicine, the tension between tradition and innovation, between observation and experimentation, and between bodily intuition and emerging scientific understanding. Even as we look back at these practices with curiosity, a question lingers: how did ordinary people reconcile the strange, sometimes unpleasant, use of urine with the desire for effective health care? How did trust, ritual, and belief sustain a practice that seems so alien to us today? And, more quietly, it invites reflection: what present-day medical or wellness practices might, centuries from now, seem just as bizarre, impractical, or unthinkable as drinking urine seems to us now? When you last imagined the quiet Victorian bedroom, the chamber pot in the corner, and the timid patient lifting a glass of urine to their lips, you were seeing only the beginning of a complex story. Urine therapy in the 19th century was not merely an oddity of private domestic life, it was entwined with evolving medical science, social norms, and the human desire for accessible remedies. To understand its persistence, you need to explore the debates, experiments, and cultural practices that sustained it. By the mid-1800s, science in Europe was accelerating. Chemistry, physiology, and microbiology were transforming medicine, but the medical community remained divided on many points. Urine therapy, in particular, sparked lively discussion. Some physicians dismissed it outright, seeing it as superstition. They argued that reintroducing waste could do nothing to improve health. Yet others reported occasional positive outcomes and insisted that urine contained minerals, salts, and other components beneficial for specific ailments. The divide often aligned with experience. City physicians trained in hospitals leaned toward skepticism, while rural doctors, who relied heavily on observation and patient feedback, continued to recommend it.in journals and pamphlets. Physicians exchanged careful arguments. Articles described experiments with animals, chemical analyses of urine, and comparisons between patients who drank their own urine and those who did not. The results were inconsistent, as you might expect, given the variation in diet, hydration, and a general lack of controlled methodology. Yet the debate itself lent legitimacy to the practice. If learned men were still discussing it, it could not be dismissed entirely. Outside the physician's office, urine therapy was embedded in daily life. Mothers might administer small amounts to children with fevers or digestive complaints. Midwives sometimes used it as a topical treatment for skin irritations in infants. Housewives kept carefully labeled containers in kitchens and bedrooms, adhering to precise collection times. Morning urine was preferred for strength, diluted with water or mixed with wine for taste. These routines were unremarkable in the domestic setting. They were part of a broader Victorian ethos that valued order, hygiene, and self-management. The collection, storage, and administration of urine became a ritualized practice, quietly reinforcing the household's belief in its efficacy. The methodical nature of these practices highlights the boring side of history. Small, repetitive actions that may seem mundane but sustain the credibility of a medical tradition for generations. Without attention to detail, the remedy might fail or become contaminated. With care, however, it appeared credible, safe, and rational. Part of urine therapy's persistence was psychological. Humans are deeply influenced by belief and expectation, particularly regarding health. If a patient consumed a tonic daily, carefully measured and administered, it could create a sense of control over illness. This was especially important in an era when medicine offered few guaranteed cures. Moreover, using one's own bodily fluids reinforced the idea of self-sufficiency. Patients were taking health into their own hands, literally internalizing a personal remedy. Even if the physiological benefits were minimal, the psychological reassurance could be real. Some Victorian health guides acknowledged this implicitly. Authors recommended urine therapy not only for its supposed chemical properties but also for the confidence it instilled in the patient. The act of participation, of following a disciplined regimen, was itself considered therapeutic. Interestingly, urine therapy also intersected with the rise of early chemistry. Chemists analyzed urine, noting the presence of urea, ammonia, salts, and other compounds. Some recognized that these chemicals had antiseptic or mildly stimulating effects. However, their concentration and bioavailability were too low to constitute a reliable medicine for most diseases. Yet this chemical understanding blurred the line between folklore and empirical science. Advocates argued that science confirmed what they had long observed: urine had subtle benefits. Skeptics countered that the observed effects were placebo or coincidental. These debates illustrate an important point: Victorian medicine was not a simple dichotomy between superstition and science. It was a spectrum, in which practices like urine therapy could inhabit both realms simultaneously. Urine therapy also reflected issues of accessibility. Imported medicines, patent remedies, and chemically prepared tonics were expensive. Urine, by contrast, was free, available to everyone, and culturally sanctioned as safe. In working-class homes, this made it a practical choice. Housewives could administer it without paying a doctor or purchasing rare ingredients. In middle and upper-class households, it sometimes became a curious experiment, a novelty or a fashionable adherence to a natural remedy. The universality of urine as a resource highlights a key theme in Victorian medicine. Solutions were sought not only in laboratories and apothecaries but in the immediate environment of the home. Health was not just about doctors and hospitals, it was about daily routines, careful observation, and resourcefulness. Accounts from the period provide glimpses into everyday use. One report describes a physician who advised a patient with chronic fatigue to drink a teaspoon of morning urine each day, mixed with warm water. After several weeks, the patient reported increased energy, which may have been attributable to hydration or placebo effect. Another case involves topical application. A man with persistent skin irritation applied diluted urine to the area twice daily. After a month, the rash improved, likely due to mild antiseptic action from urea and ammonia. These examples show that even within an unusual practice, small measurable effects sometimes reinforced belief. Yet failures were equally common. Some patients found the practice unpleasant or ineffective, leading to ridicule in newspapers and medical journals. Critics emphasized the need for scientific rigor and empirical evidence, gradually shaping public opinion against the practice. By the late Victorian period, urine therapy began to fall out of favor. The rise of bacteriology, vaccines, and chemical pharmacology offered alternatives that were demonstrably effective. Physicians increasingly emphasized sanitation, nutrition, and evidence-based treatments. Drinking urine, once an accepted tonic, was now ridiculed in medical texts and popular culture. Still, the practice did not vanish overnight. Reports indicate that some rural communities continued it well into the 20th century, a testament to the resilience of tradition and belief. Urine therapy is often dismissed as an oddity of history, a curiosity to provoke amusement or disgust. Yet if you step back, it illustrates profound truths about human behavior, medicine, and society. It shows how ordinary people make sense of health in an uncertain world, how observation, habit, and belief intersect with scientific reasoning, and how domestic routines can sustain medical practices across generations. It reminds us that medicine is not only about chemicals or cures but about rituals, trust, and psychological comfort. And it leaves a lingering thought: what practices today, widely accepted or fashionable, might seem as strange, unpalatable, or incomprehensible to people a century from now. By the late Victorian era, the practice of drinking, bathing in, or applying urine as medicine was approaching the end of its long, curious history. The transformation was gradual, shaped by scientific advances, cultural shifts, and evolving notions of hygiene, propriety, and morality. Yet the story of urine therapy offers a fascinating glimpse into how ordinary people and medical authorities negotiated belief, evidence, and practicality in a world where illness was often mysterious and remedies scarce. The 19th century saw the birth of modern medicine. Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch began demonstrating that microorganisms cause disease. Vaccines became more widespread. Chemical analysis advanced, revealing the composition of bodily fluids in precise detail. Physicians increasingly relied on empirical evidence, laboratory experiments, and controlled observations rather than centuries-old traditions. In this climate, urine therapy was difficult to justify scientifically. Doctors understood that while urine contained some compounds, urea, salts, trace minerals, these were not likely to cure the diseases for which it had been prescribed. The practice began to appear outdated, a relic of an earlier era when observation and belief often outweighed systematic experimentation. Medical journals published critiques and warnings. Some physicians openly ridiculed the practice, while others simply ceased recommending it, favoring remedies with demonstrable effects. Public health campaigns and hygiene movements further undermined confidence in using bodily waste therapeutically, emphasizing sanitation and cleanliness as central to health. While medicine abandoned urine therapy, cultural perceptions were equally important in hastening its decline. The Victorian preoccupation with propriety, modesty, and the regulation of domestic behavior made drinking or bathing in urine increasingly embarrassing. What had once been a serious, practical remedy now began to provoke shame and ridicule. Literature and newspapers of the era mocked the practice, depicting it as eccentric or grotesque. Cartoons showed caricatures of patients sipping from chamber pots, emphasizing the absurdity of the act. Social pressure, combined with emerging scientific knowledge, created an environment in which urine therapy could no longer be widely defended. Yet despite public scorn, the practice lingered in private. Rural households, less connected to scientific discourse and urban norms, sometimes continued the tradition well into the early 20th century. The persistence of these practices illustrates how medicine, culture, and habit are intertwined, and how change often travels unevenly through society. One of the most striking aspects of urine therapy was its integration into daily domestic routines. Housewives and caretakers meticulously collected urine, noting the time of day and ensuring it was stored in clean, labeled vessels. The morning sample was prized for its supposed potency. Dilution and mixing with water or wine were carefully prescribed to balance taste and perceived effect. These repetitive, detailed routines highlight a boring, yet essential part of historical medical practice, the maintenance of habit and ritual. Small, precise actions, collecting, storing, measuring, were crucial to sustaining the practice. Without attention to these details, the remedy might fail or cause harm. In this way, mundane domestic labor underpinned the credibility of a strange and now unthinkable form of medicine. Even when science began to question urine therapy, the ritualized nature of its use ensured that it persisted for generations. People trusted what they had seen work in their own households, reinforced by anecdotal accounts from neighbors and family members. Historical accounts of urine therapy offer glimpses into the lived experience of the practice. One physician recounted a patient who drank small daily doses to strengthen digestion. After several weeks, the patient reported feeling more energetic, illustrating the potential placebo effect and psychological reinforcement. In another case, a woman with a persistent rash applied diluted urine to the skin, observing gradual improvement. Modern interpretation suggests mild antiseptic properties of urea may have played a role, but to Victorian observers, it confirmed the remedy's efficacy. There were failures too. Not all patients benefited, and some experienced nausea or distress. These inconsistent results, however, did not immediately discredit the practice. Belief and observation often outweighed systematic evidence in the domestic sphere. By the early 20th century, urine therapy was largely abandoned as a mainstream medical practice. The proliferation of chemical medicines, vaccines, and scientifically validated treatments made the remedy seem unnecessary, ineffective, or even unhygienic. Hospitals and urban physicians no longer prescribed it, and public ridicule further discouraged use. Yet its decline was not uniform. Some rural areas retained the practice for decades, a testament to the enduring power of habit, cultural transmission, and trust in household experience over institutional authority. In this way, urine therapy illustrates a broader historical principle: the pace of change in medical practice is uneven, shaped by both science and society. Looking back, urine therapy may appear bizarre, even repulsive. But it exemplifies the complex interaction of belief, observation, tradition, and psychology in human health practices. It shows how people navigate uncertainty. When reliable cures are scarce, they rely on experience, ritual, and authority. It demonstrates the persistence of domestic knowledge, where ordinary households became laboratories for experimentation and observation. And it reminds us that medicine is never purely technical, it is embedded in culture, social norms, and human psychology. Today, urine therapy survives mostly in historical accounts, medical curiosities, and occasional alternative health discussions. It stands as a peculiar reminder of how practices once considered rational can, in time, seem strange or even grotesque. Yet there is also a broader lesson. The story of urine therapy is not only about a strange remedy, it is about human ingenuity, resourcefulness, and the ways people attempt to control illness with the materials at hand. It is about the gradual negotiation between tradition and innovation, superstition and science. In reflecting on this, you might ask, what everyday practices today, medical, dietary, or cultural, might seem just as unusual, unpalatable, or inexplicable to future generations? How will the combination of science, habit, and belief shape the therapies and rituals that we take for granted? Imagine stepping into a Victorian household in the late 1800s. The parlor is neatly arranged, the walls lined with portraits of stern ancestors, the floors polished to a soft gleam. On the mantel, a small cabinet holds bottles of tinctures, powders, and oils. In the kitchen, a mother measures doses of laudanum for a fussy child. Elsewhere, a small jar of leeches waits for the next patient, quietly wriggling in water. At first glance, the scene might seem unusual, even alarming. But for Victorians, this was ordinary. Homes were not merely places of rest, they were centers of domestic medicine, where families administered treatments, observed symptoms, and experimented with remedies. The boundary between household and clinic was blurred, and ordinary people were actively engaged in their own health care. Leeches are among the most famous of Victorian remedies, though their use stretches back to ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome. By the 19th century, leeches were a staple in both hospitals and homes. Doctors and midwives prescribed them to treat everything from fevers and headaches to more serious illnesses. The logic was rooted in humoral theory: removing excess blood would restore balance to the body's fluids and relieve illness. Leeches were surprisingly effective for certain conditions. They release anticoagulants and stimulate circulation, which could help with some forms of swelling or blood congestion. But the underlying rationale, the belief that blood needed to be balanced to maintain health, was a holdover from centuries of medical tradition. In the home, leeching was a careful ritual. Families would prepare clean water, warm it to the right temperature, and gently attach the leech to the patient's skin. They monitored the process, sometimes letting the leech feed for hours, and recorded observations in diaries or notebooks. These details, repetitive and mundane as they may seem, were considered essential for success. Alongside leeches, laudanum, an opium-based tincture, was another cornerstone of Victorian domestic medicine. Physicians prescribed it for pain, insomnia, coughs, and digestive issues. It was often administered in precise doses to infants, children, and adults alike. Today, we recognize laudanum as addictive and potentially dangerous. But in a world without modern analgesics or sedatives, it offered tangible relief. Victorian families relied on it for comfort and control over symptoms that otherwise could not be alleviated. Mothers carefully measured drops into spoons or added it to warm milk, trusting both the substance and the authority of medical advice. The mundane practice of measuring and administering laudanum exemplifies a broader historical pattern. Small, precise domestic rituals were crucial to sustaining medical practices. They created the appearance of order, control, and rationality, even when the treatments themselves were unconventional. Beyond leeches and laudanum, homes contained a dizzying array of remedies. Salves, powders, herbal teas, and tinctures were meticulously labeled and stored. Families observed symptoms, compared results, and sometimes improvised their own combinations. This was not amateur experimentation in the modern sense. It was disciplined observation within a framework of inherited knowledge, often passed down from mother to daughter, father to son. Ordinary people became their own physicians, using available resources to manage everyday illness. For example, mothers might apply poultices to soothe feverish children, while fathers monitored diet and exercise to address digestive problems. The repetition and careful recording of these actions ensured that remedies were administered consistently. These boring routines, though unremarkable, were the backbone of domestic medicine. Victorian domestic medicine was shaped by a tension between tradition and innovation. Hospitals and physicians increasingly embraced scientific methods, while households often retained older practices. Leeches, laudanum, poultices, and home-brewed remedies coexisted with new chemical medicines and vaccines. This tension highlights the slow pace of change in medicine. Scientific discoveries could take decades to reach ordinary households, and even then, acceptance depended on trust, habit, and cultural norms. Families continued using familiar remedies because they were known quantities. They offered comfort, predictability, and a sense of control. That a defining feature of domestic medicine was meticulous observation. Parents and caregivers kept notes on symptoms, dosage, timing, and responses. Diaries, notebooks, and letters often include detailed accounts of treatments, sometimes describing minor successes, failures, or unexpected effects. This practice underscores the importance of boring repetition in historical medicine. Success depended less on the inherent efficacy of a remedy and more on careful administration and attentive monitoring. In this sense, the everyday routines of domestic care were as significant as the treatments themselves. Many remedies also offered psychological reassurance. Leeches, laudanum, and poultices were tangible, visible actions that demonstrated care and attentiveness. Administering them provided a sense of control over illness, reducing anxiety for both patients and caregivers. This psychological dimension was critical in a time when many diseases were mysterious, chronic, or untreatable. The act of giving medicine, even something now considered strange, could be as important as the chemical or biological effect of the remedy itself. Historical accounts reveal the ordinary realities of these practices. One mother described attaching a leech to her child's arm for a persistent fever, monitoring the process closely, and noting the child's response over several hours. Another account details a father giving measured doses of laudanum to a restless infant, carefully recording each administration in a household ledger. Such anecdotes illustrate the intersection of discipline, observation, and ritual in domestic medicine. They also highlight the human desire for agency in the face of illness, a theme that recurs throughout history. As you imagine these homes, with their jars, leeches, and tinctures, it becomes clear that Victorian medicine was as much about habit, observation, and belief as it was about chemistry or biology. Families relied on practical routines, carefully maintained rituals, and a deep trust in inherited knowledge. But a question remains: how did ordinary people reconcile the contradictions of Victorian medicine, the coexistence of superstition and emerging science, of potentially harmful remedies and careful observation? How did trust, habit, and psychological reassurance sustain practices that seem strange, dangerous, or even absurd today? And, perhaps more provocatively, what practices in our own time, seemingly rational, widely accepted, or culturally endorsed, might be judged as bizarre or incomprehensible by future generations? As we move further into Victorian households, the picture of domestic medicine becomes more intricate. Homes were not only places of rest but also sites of active medical practice, where families administered remedies, monitored symptoms, and debated their effectiveness. The boring details of these routines, precise dosages, repeated observations, and meticulous record-keeping, revealed a sophisticated, though often unscientific, approach to health. Victorian medicine was caught between the fading humoral traditions and the emerging scientific paradigm. While hospitals and medical schools increasingly embraced empirical observation and chemical treatments, households often maintained older practices like bloodletting with leeches, poultices, herbal remedies, and laudanum administration. This coexistence of old and new was not chaotic. It reflected an ongoing negotiation between trust, tradition, and innovation. Families relied on remedies that had worked for generations while cautiously experimenting with new treatments introduced by physicians or pharmacists. For example, while a doctor might recommend a chemical tonic to treat digestive complaints, a mother might still prepare a herbal decoction or apply a poultice. Both remedies were administered side by side, each with its own rationale, demonstrating how ordinary people adapted emerging medical knowledge to familiar practices. The broader Victorian public had complex feelings about these remedies. Leeches and laudanum were widely accepted, yet they were also subjects of curiosity, satire, and occasional fear. Newspapers and periodicals published articles mocking excessive reliance on home remedies or describing amusing misadventures with overzealous application. Humor often served a social function. It reinforced norms and discouraged misuse, while allowing the audience to engage with the strange aspects of medical practice without direct confrontation. Caricatures of patients with leeches attached or children receiving laudanum illustrated both the fascination and apprehension the public felt toward domestic medicine. At the same time, home remedies were taken seriously in everyday life. The tension between public mockery and private practice highlights a key dynamic in Victorian society. The negotiation between social perception, personal experience, and trust in inherited knowledge. Observation was central to Victorian domestic medicine. Families monitored symptoms meticulously, recorded dosages, and noted any improvements or adverse effects. These small, repetitive routines, measuring drops of laudanum, timing leech applications, or changing poultices, formed a systematic, though informal, method of practice. Such routines often created the illusion of control, particularly important in an era where illness could strike unpredictably and treatment options were limited. Through careful monitoring, households created their own data, which shaped decisions and reinforced beliefs about efficacy. Interestingly, these domestic experiments sometimes anticipated scientific methods. While lacking rigorous controls, they emphasized observation, documentation, and adjustment based on outcomes, the core principles of empirical study, albeit applied in a private, practical context. Consider the story of a household managing a child's persistent fever. The mother might administer a small leech to relieve blood congestion, record the child's temperature and behavior, and follow up with a herbal tea or gentle massage. In another family, laudanum could be given to soothe colic, while a poultice treated skin irritation. These case studies reveal the interplay of multiple remedies and careful observation. Success was rarely dramatic, it was subtle, incremental, and often dependent on consistent, repeated care. The boring attention to detail, from measuring liquids to monitoring responses, was what sustained these practices over decades. As scientific medicine gained prominence, physicians increasingly questioned home remedies. Hospitals began to standardize treatments, favoring chemical compounds with predictable effects over traditional or anecdotal remedies. Yet skepticism did not immediately displace domestic practices. Families often trusted personal experience over professional advice, particularly when access to doctors was limited or treatments were expensive. Rural households, in particular, relied on home remedies for convenience, affordability, and continuity of care. These debates illustrate a broader historical truth: the adoption of new medical knowledge is gradual and uneven, shaped by social, economic, and cultural factors as much as by scientific evidence. Home remedies also had a social function. Administering care reinforced family roles. Mothers and caregivers acted as de facto physicians, fathers sometimes supervised or supported, and children observed and learned. Knowledge was transmitted intergenerationally, creating continuity and trust in particular practices. Moreover, domestic remedies fostered a sense of agency. In a time when serious illnesses could not be reliably treated, families found empowerment through hands-on care. Even unconventional or scientifically unsupported practices, leeching, laudanum dosing, poultices, provided psychological reassurance and a sense of control. This social and psychological aspect underscores why some remedies persisted even as hospitals and physicians increasingly embraced modern medicine. People valued what worked in their lived experience, even if it conflicted with emerging scientific standards. Victorian domestic medicine thrived on repetition, detail, and ritual. Daily routines of measuring, observing, and recording were essential for maintaining the perceived efficacy of remedies. These mundane practices, while boring in narrative terms, were crucial to sustaining the culture of home health care. They also reveal the ingenuity of ordinary people. Families adapted limited resources, blended old and new remedies, and continuously experimented to improve outcomes. In this sense, the story of Victorian home medicine is not merely about strange substances, it is about human resourcefulness, patience, and the quiet persistence of knowledge. As you imagine these households, chamber pots, jars of tincture, wriggling leeches, and careful mothers measuring doses, you begin to see a pattern. Domestic medicine was more than superstition or curiosity, it was a structured system of care, observation, and experimentation. It demonstrates how ordinary people navigate uncertainty, manage risk, and sustain belief through small, repeated actions. And, inevitably, a question arises: what practices in our own time, widely accepted or culturally endorsed, might seem just as peculiar, mundane, or even misguided to future generations? How will they interpret the balance we strike between tradition, scientific authority, and personal experience in the pursuit of health? As the Victorian era drew to a close, the familiar jars, leeches, and tinctures of domestic medicine began to fade from everyday households. The emergence of scientific medicine, industrially produced pharmaceuticals, and a growing emphasis on hygiene and standardized treatment reshaped healthcare across Britain and beyond. Yet the story of home remedies, how ordinary families measured, observed, and cared for one another, leaves enduring insights into human ingenuity, resilience, and the evolution of medicine. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, hospitals and medical schools have become centers of systematic, empirical practice. Discoveries in microbiology, germ theory, and pharmacology offered reliable treatments for diseases that had once been mysterious or fatal. Vaccines, antiseptics, and chemical medicines replaced older remedies with scientifically validated interventions. This scientific advance rendered many traditional home practices obsolete. Leeches, laudanum, poultices, and herbal concoctions were increasingly criticized in medical journals, textbooks, and public discourse. Physicians emphasized the dangers of unregulated dosing, the risks of contamination, and the unpredictable efficacy of domestic remedies. Public health campaigns reinforced these messages, urging families to adopt hygiene practices and standardized treatments. Yet the transition was gradual. While urban middle-class households quickly embraced modern medicine, rural families often continued traditional practices for decades. Access, habit, and trust in familiar methods slowed the spread of change. This uneven transition underscores a key theme in medical history: progress is rarely linear, and cultural inertia often shapes the adoption of new practices. As modern medicine advanced, home remedies became subjects of curiosity, humor, and ridicule. Newspapers, periodicals, and cartoons depicted exaggerated scenes of families administering leeches or dosing children with laudanum. These portrayals served multiple functions: they entertained, reinforced social norms, and discouraged misuse of remedies considered outdated or dangerous. Yet ridicule did not entirely eliminate the practice. Some families continued traditional treatments in private, relying on them for comfort, familiarity, and the psychological reassurance that comes from hands-on care. The persistence of these practices highlights the complex interplay between public discourse, cultural authority, and personal experience. Leeches, once central to domestic medicine, were gradually restricted to hospital use and specialized medical contexts. Scientific studies revealed that indiscriminate bloodletting was largely ineffective and sometimes harmful. By the early 20th century, leeches were mostly used for specific surgical purposes, such as relieving venous congestion after reconstructive procedures, a far cry from their daily use in Victorian homes. Laudanum, while still available, became heavily regulated due to its addictive properties. As safer and more effective analgesics emerged, routine use for children or minor ailments declined sharply. What had once been a commonplace domestic practice, mothers carefully measuring drops for colic or sleeplessness, was now discouraged or outlawed. The decline of these remedies illustrates a broader principle: medical practices evolve not only through discovery but also through cultural negotiation, regulation, and shifts in social perception. The story of Victorian home remedies offers several lessons about human behavior and medicine. Observation and routine matter. Success often depended on careful, repetitive attention to detail, rather than the inherent efficacy of the remedy itself. Measuring doses, timing applications, and monitoring symptoms created a sense of order and control. Psychological reassurance. Remedies provided more than physical benefit, they offered comfort, agency, and confidence in uncertain times. The act of giving care was therapeutic for both caregiver and patient. Adaptation and resourcefulness. Families blended tradition and innovation, experimenting with combinations of remedies, observing results, and adjusting practices over time. This highlights the creativity and adaptability inherent in ordinary households. Cultural persistence. Practices persisted not only because of perceived efficacy but also because of habit, trust, and social norms. Cultural transmission can maintain methods long after scientific evidence questions their validity. Though these remedies are largely obsolete today, they shaped the trajectory of modern medicine. Household observation, attention to detail, and the integration of care into daily life informed broader understandings of patient monitoring and self-care. Early skepticism, experimentation, and documentation created a foundation for the eventual adoption of empirical methods in both hospitals and homes. Moreover, the story underscores a recurring theme in human history: what seems strange or unpalatable now was once considered rational, necessary, or even sophisticated. Leeches, laudanum, and poultices remind us that medicine is not static, it is shaped by culture, psychology, and available knowledge as much as by biology. As you consider the routines of Victorian households, the careful application of leeches, the precise dosing of laudanum, the preparation of poultices, an important question arises: how will future generations perceive our own medical practices? Which of our daily health rituals, medications, or wellness trends will appear strange, excessive, or misguided in the centuries to come? The story of Victorian home remedies, mundane yet significant, encourages a reflective perspective. It teaches patience, attention to detail, and humility, the recognition that human attempts to understand and control health are always embedded in a particular cultural and scientific moment. What seems boring or ordinary can, in fact, reveal profound insights into resilience, adaptation, and the pursuit of well-being across history.